Dzień dobry, dobry wieczór. Witam Państwa bardzo serdecznie na kolejnym, już 8 w tym roku i 4 tej jesieni spotkaniu w ramach cyklu Elementy Architektury. Elementy Architektury to cykl spotkań poświęconych architekturze oczywiście, ale takiemu szerszemu, krytycznemu spojrzeniu na przestrzeń, na otaczającą nas rzeczywistość. Dzięki gościnności Instytutu Goethego mamy możliwość od 2017 roku zapraszać praktyków, architektów, architektki, teoretyków z różnych stron świata, z Europy, z Stanów Zjednoczonych, z Polski, zapraszać do dyskusji właśnie na najbardziej palące problemy związane z architekturą dzisiaj. W tym roku wiosną mieliśmy okazję dyskutować o roli kobiet w architekturze. Tematem były architektki. Jesienią postanowiliśmy przyjrzeć się katastrofie klimatycznej. Katastrofie klimatu, budowaniu i właśnie temu, sądzę, dzisiaj najbardziej palącemu zjawisku. Rozpoczęliśmy przed miesiącem. Już dzisiaj chciałbym Państwa zaprosić do zapoznania się z materiałami filmowymi, które powstały po tych pierwszych spotkaniach, po spotkaniu z grupą Centrala, po spotkaniu z Kacprem Kępińskim, po rozmowie z Rosario Talevi. To był październik, natomiast dzisiaj chciałbym Państwa przywitać na spotkaniu z naszym specjalnym gościem. Jest z nami pan profesor Daniel Barber. Pan profesor Barber związany jest ze Szkołą Architektury Uniwersytetu Technologicznego w Sydney. Przez wiele lat pracował na Uniwersytecie Pensylwanii, reprezentował Stewart Weizmann School of Design, był przewodniczącym Graduate Group in Architecture, programu doktoranckiego tego konkretnego uniwersytetu. Profesor Barber, jego badania, zainteresowania badawcze skupiają się wokół dwóch takich głównych tematów. Po pierwsze, na nowe odczytanie historii modernizmu w architekturze w kontekście problemów ekologicznych. Z kolei ten drugi temat badań profesora Barbera to tworzenie ram teoretycznych pomocnych architektom i innym osobom angażującym się w rozwiązywanie kryzysu klimatycznego. Nie tak dawno temu opublikowana została książka profesora Barbera Modern Architecture and Climate – Design Before Air Conditioning. Ta książka stała się inspiracją dla koleżanek, redaktorek z kwartalnika Autoportret. Rozmowę z profesorem Barberem można znaleźć w autoportrecie, ale też kiedy pracowaliśmy nad przygotowaniem tego kursu, stało się dla nas oczywistym, że musimy się zwrócić do profesora Barbera z zaproszeniem, aby przyjechał do Polski, przyjechał do Krakowa i opowiedział nam o tym, czym budynki mogłyby być, gdyby wyłączyć klimatyzację, czym mogłyby być i jak mogłyby funkcjonować. Tyle słowem wstępu. Bardzo się cieszę, że możemy się dzisiaj spotkać w tak szerokim gronie. Wykład zostanie przeprowadzony w języku angielskim. Po wykładzie będzie też czas na serię pytań. Także dzień dobry, dobry wieczór. Daniel, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Nicole. Thank you all for coming. Let's see. Give me just 1 second to get everything. I'm going to sit and relax. I'm going to sit down and do I need the mic? Yeah, I should probably use the mic. Okay. Oops. Okay, well, thank you very much for that introduction. I assume it was very generous. I understood 2 words, Daniel and Barber. So that's the condition we're in today. I'm very happy to be here and to discuss this research. I want to thank Michal, thank Marta, and also Dorota Lesniak in absentia for the invitation and the work that has been done to translate the essay and sort of bring this work to this audience. I really am honored and touched by the interest. So I'm hoping to do a few things this evening, and I'm probably going to talk for around 45 minutes, 50 minutes, a little longer than normal. I want to hope that we can get everything understood. I'm going to first sort of give an extended preamble to get some issues on the table, then dive into a set of historical episodes, and from there sort of move into a conclusion with some reflections on the prospects for the kinds of transformations we might be trying to cultivate. All of this in an attempt to consider a new role, let's say a new social purpose for architecture in the midst of the climate emergency, right? That's kind of the topic on the table today. I'm going to talk from a perspective that assumes or that suggests that what we have come to call sustainable architecture, and this is my sort of emblematic sustainable building, is now a thing of the past. A failed project that, much like the COP climate negotiations just concluded in Egypt, served to barely impact the rise of climate emissions. Since, as many of us know, sustainable or green architecture emerged in the 1980s, carbon emissions from buildings have of course continued to increase at a fast pace. Evidence that is that sustainability is not enough. Or as Sarah El Batouti, an architect recently appointed as the UN's Race to Zero ambassador, noted yesterday in an interview relative to the COP conference, despite the good intentions of many architects, as she put it, quote, "Too often we create a silly building design and then put some solar panels on top and call it green architecture," unquote. We know this general phenomenon, right? Another UN representative, the geoscientist Yamina Saheb, puts it a bit differently, as she wrote relative to a UN report from April, quote, "The building industry is lagging behind all other sectors. It hasn't modernized at all since the Second World War," unquote. And what she means by modernized there is not our kind of architectural terms for modernity, but rather that we are still operating with a template of steel, concrete, and glass, and a sealed interior, as we'll talk about quite a bit today, that began to develop right after World War II. So that these design methods and material supply chains have become so deeply embedded in what we call architecture that it appears quite difficult to kind of move past them, right? Okay. So in the April report released by the UN, by the IPCC, focused on climate mitigation, this point was made in more detail. According to the UN, the increase in energy efficiency in the building sector, the impact, that is, of more efficient heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems, of solar panels and insulated glass systems, and other minor adjustments, all of these efficiency measures have been overwhelmed by an overall increase in the floor area per capita. Right, so globally, and especially in what I like to call the over-industrialized North, while we have produced more efficient buildings, we have also produced more of them, and they are larger and taller, right? Such that there is more air conditioning, more steel, concrete, and glass, more of everything, thus increasing the carbon emitted in the atmosphere on a daily basis, thus increasing the scale of the challenge of a transition to a less carbon-dependent world. I'm not going to play out this kind of sustainability critique in great detail, but rather just to recognize that sustainable architecture has been a means to allow business as usual with minor inflections, building more or less as usual. And this is, in many ways what sort of got us into this mess, right? Not only the sort of buildings that we know that are carbon emitters, but even those that are emitting a little bit less, right? That have become a sort of permission to keep building as before. We've all seen the charts or can imagine them, the line of carbon emissions climbing endlessly upwards. The failure of sustainability, or at least its sloppiness, is an indication of a need for a more dramatic epistemological shift. Not slightly better performing buildings, right? Not minor adjustments to the energy system, not formal inflections on familiar typologies, but a more dramatic reassessment of the social role of the field and the ways we might, in a sense, start at the beginning relative to the history of modern architecture, to build up a new narrative appropriate to our current moment. What would such a narrative look like? How can we describe and define this transition challenge at the level of our understanding of architecture and its social role? The mitigation report, again, the UN IPCC report from April, is precise in this regard, that the paradigm shift that is needed in the building industry and elsewhere is a move from efficiency to sufficiency. right? Sufficiency, the IPCC authors note, and I quote, differs from efficiency. Efficiency is about continuous, short-term, marginal technological improvements. That is, it plays the same game, only a little better. Sufficiency, by contrast, to quote again, is, quote, about the long-term actions driven by non-technological solutions which consume less energy in absolute terms, end quote. So a different game, right? Not a better way to play the same game, but to change the game completely, or at least operate according to a different set of rules. Sustainable architecture, of course, operates on this efficiency paradigm, right? Slight adjustments to spatial, material, and technological approaches to building that allow for marginal improvements, but do not meet the challenge of the present. What is needed is a new kind of architecture, a new conception of its social purpose, and a shift in how we value a building or urban intervention. So what I'm trying to start to put together is kind of the terms and the concepts and the histories that can help us to construct this new vision or this kind of alternate proposal for architecture that talks about sufficiency, that engages with some of these questions, and that thinks then about how to sort of do more with less, right? Another way that the UN talks about sufficiency is with the phrase demand management, right? That we just don't need as much as we think we do. So these are all things to keep in mind. Air conditioning is at the center of this challenge. Can you see the slides okay? The light isn't? Okay. Air conditioning is at the center of this challenge and of the transformation to come. Air conditioning, as the philosopher Peter Sloterdijk puts it, quote, in the literal sense, will establish itself as the main space political theme of the coming era, which is to say of our era today. Air conditioning and HVAC, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning more generally, has been a primary target of the efficiency trajectory. Through HVAC, we have filled our interiors with fossil fuels. Buildings have become systems for processing energy resources as those resources are drawn out of the soil, processed and burned to power mechanical conditioning systems. And the supply chains and technological trajectories shepherded by HVAC, in particular the sealed high-rise office tower developed in the US in the 1950s and then of course spread widely around the world, and the mechanical provision of comfort on which it relies, right, has been this kind of template. So in this sense, air conditioning has produced, or at least contributed to the production of, a world of comfort and consistency at great cost. The thermal comfort generated inside has, through the carbon emissions from these HVAC systems, degraded the prospects for life outside. Right, and this is, again, just sort of one of many possible examples. I mean, of course, an important one to the history of the field. But we all know, of course, the kind of celebration of the curtain wall and its facing, with its kind of super thinness, right? It's a very thin piece of glass. This is not an insulated panel. And we can sort of imagine, in fact, that these heating registers, do I have a pointer? I assume I do. Yeah, the heating registers there, right on the edge are sort of just heating the lower atmosphere of Manhattan, right, as much as they're improving the comfort of the building. So this is the architectural horizon of the just transition, right? How to redesign life in the thermal interior, how to disrupt the industrial infrastructures and technological trajectories of the 20th century that have produced these no longer sustainable ways of life, how to, in short, imagine a radically different future cultivated and facilitated by new kinds of buildings, new experiences of comfort, new parameters for the value of good design. So that was the preamble, right? And now I'm going to talk about some historical, that kind of sets us up, puts some issues on the table. I'm going to now dive into a narrative about some stories of other ways of building, right? Before air conditioning, or really kind of alongside it, that might help us to think through this a bit more carefully. So we start our story in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro in the early 1940s with this building, the Instituto de Resseguros do Brasil, I'll call it the IRB, the Brazilian Reinsurance Agency. And what better site indeed to reconsider the contours of architecture and climate than a building constructed to manage risk, right? Reinsuring insurers and corporations to join in the industrialization, the modernization, the sort of capitalization of the Brazilian territory. A saga, of course, that plays out in different ways across so-called developing economies still, as an explicit means of inserting, exporting a set of economic systems, right? Constructing this global economic system through, constructing this global economic system and set of social expectations, in part through buildings. Modern architecture, in this sense, is a sort of interventionary mechanism, right? Expanding the scope and increasing the velocity of the flow of capital, expanding the territory of the global. The IRB, this building here, commissioned by the government of Getúlio Vargas, was designed and built in Rio in 1942 by the Roberto brothers, two of whom had studied under Lúcio Costa. The building has an elaborate set of shading mechanisms. It was carefully designed for dynamic interaction with its specific climate. The different facades, as we see here, had different treatments according to their solar exposure. The north sun-facing facade, right, northern exposure facing the sun in the southern hemisphere, seen on the left, had alternating banks of fixed shading louvers with two vertical circulation systems faced with glass brick. And then the south end, the south and east facades, consisted largely of these bands, alternating bands of glass and masonry. And we'll get into some details of these in a moment. We can also glimpse here the still in construction nature of the surroundings, right? Suggesting the importance of climate and its management as an aspect of an architecture focused on economic development. This building, again, a government-funded project to house reinsurance agents such as Lloyd's or Swiss Re, explicitly a means to encourage and facilitate development in the rapidly industrializing country. Technological glitch, what's going on? There we go. The northern facade consists of two layers, right? This might get a little tricky. Let's see. The first one, as we can see in this section, right, the sort of first layer here is about 2/3 glazing, and then the second exterior, which we see better actually in this photograph, was this set of fixed louver panels hung at a slight distance. The second skin was prefabricated and attached on site. The reinforced concrete louvers were formed in a shallow S-curve in plan, which we can see down here. The outer face of the louver was a heat deflecting surface, the diagram indicates, right, to block the penetrating rays of the summer sun. The inner face was a light reflecting surface to increase the daylight transmitted into the interior. There was also a heat dispersion space, right, that we see here, which was sort of ventilated by these open spaces at the top of each of these banks, right. The interior wall, evident again in section, was divided between a thick storage block on the bottom, itself also heat deflecting, and then these operable windows. We can see the effects of this system in period photographs of the interior. Little direct solar penetration, but perhaps quite light. It's difficult to tell given the vicissitudes of film exposure. These daylight aspects were intensified by the use of an open office space, glass brick walls, and other transparent partitions, and the consigning of filing systems to the perimeter. This was an early attempt, another interior view, which just sort of speaks insurance to me, at least, this kind of series of seemingly anonymous kind of office blocks with these type registers. This was an early attempt using modern materials and techniques to align a building with its regional climate in order to control, to some extent, thermal and lighting conditions on the interior. However much we may be able today to identify its many misapprehensions, it was the avant-garde of its moment. The historian and curator Barry Bergdahl, in the context of the 2015 exhibition that he curated at New York Museum of Modern Art called Latin America Under Construction, Bergdahl wrote that the emergence of a distinctly South American modernism, and we'll see many more examples in a moment, involved projects and buildings that, quote, are not the belated reflections of examples set in Europe, but previsions of a modernization to come, end quote. A premise which, it is worth noting, and which Bergdahl himself notes, has been a part of Brazilian written histories for decades, which is to say, histories of modern architecture written in Brazil have noted the importance of Brazil as a site for the emergence of ideas rather than receiving them, let's say, from France. We'll get into that again in a second, too. Yet Bergdahl's precise articulation helps us tease something out here today. Brazil, again, was a site of emergence, of production, more than a site for reception of modern architectural ideas. The arrow of history moves from south to north, or at least is somewhat circular. Also significant, this inversion of cause and effect places climate and the elaboration of design methods to manage the thermal interior as essential to narrative conceptions of the progressive development of modernism, right? So when we place Brazil as a kind of originary space rather than a receptive space, these questions of climate become more essential. We could draw this notion of architecture as a practice for climatic adaptability back to the heart of the matter, so to speak, the heart of the history of modern architecture, if you will, to provisionally reclaim Le Corbusier on these terms. In the interwar period, Le Corbusier was preoccupied with climate control by the building as a system of climatic mediation with varying effects. We can see in the sketch on the right this sort of initial sense, right, of the basic principles of the overhang, the extended overhang, which operates differently, blocks the summer sun, allows the winter sun in, right, this kind of general sense of the different patterns of the sun. This project in Barcelona was considered by Le Corbusier to be an experiment in the warmer Mediterranean climate, which is to say a relative south to his Parisian or Genevan north. The building suggests that interest in climate patterns was integrated into more well-known aspects of Le Corbusier's work, represented perhaps by the domino drawing here on the left, the openness of the facade in particular, and its availability to be filled with glass. That this all-glass facade, and we see an example in model on the bottom here, soon led to the problem of overheating, which is to say in these kind of southern regions that he began to experiment. Indeed, early in his promotion of the so-called pan de verre, the wall of glass, in 1928, Le Corbusier already feared that, quote, the hour of doom was fast approaching for the all-glass wall, end quote, once he realized it was not feasible outside of very limited climatic conditions, right? So an idea sort of born in a relative north would not be applicable elsewhere. Viewed according to this premise of climatic adaptability, then, this hour of doom was deferred by the addition of the brise-soleil, or sun-breaking devices, as in his unbuilt project for Algiers, there on the right, to modulate solar radiation and propose a more comfortable interior, basically a second skin, as we saw in many ways of the IRB, as a means to adapt the building to its site. And just to quickly indicate, not to sort of recover Le Corbusier in this regard, but just to quickly indicate that while his master plan for Algiers has been rightly criticized for a lack of sensitivity to local conditions, the building here on the right for that was proposed for Algiers actually was commissioned, right, had a site. This is the hillside, images of the hillside that it was to be built on that I found in the archives a few years ago. So this kind of specific issue of exposure and the specific challenges of the site were directly on the table. In the Barcelona example, banks of operable shading louvers sit on the facade of compact townhouses. The sectional drawing on the left suggests a different sort of originary moment of modern architecture, not so much a template to be followed as one that was itself received, influenced by experiments in Brazil and elsewhere, by indicating, as we see here, the different states that the louver system that we see in this later model, this was a model built for an exhibition in 2002, we see in this drawing from 1933 the ways in which the louver system was kind of represented as having these different states of rest. Right now, this seems like a kind of silly thing to focus on, right? It's not that complicated, it's pretty straightforward, but it's this first moment of this kind of representation, right? A kind of mediatic event, if you will, a representation of the potential of this dynamic facade. I'm indicating perhaps that one of the projects of design was to produce a felicitous relationship to climate patterns. We can also take a look for a second at this image, another drawing of the same project, right? We can see the same basic section, if you will, but drawn somewhat differently, which is interesting for us not only because it suggests the flow of air through the building, right? We see these kind of blue lines. We now have all the arrows and red and blue and purple arrows, right? But this was just blue lines. So another kind of media event, attempt to kind of show how air moved through the building. Not only because it kind of shows how air moves through the building and has this, slightly passive sun, right? Not quite sure what to make of that. It seems, I guess, resting. But I think most importantly, this strange fellow here, right, who, as far as I was thinking beekeeping for a while, but I think it's probably butterfly catching, right? So walking along the kind of lantern roof of this building that also, as we note, has proposed a quite lively green facade, suggesting the important role of these speculative drawings, again, also of architectural media, in considering and sort of previsioning, right, premediating, back to Bergdahl's term, future modes of life. which is to say that l'esprit nouveau that underlay much of the Corbusier's work in this period was a new spirit enacting a different relationship between society and nature, between inside and outside, with the dynamic shaded facade as an essential mediating system. So to jump back for a second to this slide, and to see what might have looked like garages or indoor spaces here, what might have looked like garages are in fact these indoor-outdoor spaces, much like the jardin suspendu that Corb would specify in other contexts, that allow for the street, replete with trees and plantings, as we also see, to embody this novel social form, right, to sort of be this new spirit. In this sense, architecture was seen to have a capacity to reimagine, to re-script relationships between social practices and climate patterns, to be a modulating and mitigating device that provided a space of comfort. Okay, I think I'm going to skip this next part, but it basically just shows that Georgi Warchavchik, who was a Ukrainian, Italian, Brazilian architect, right, as happens sometimes, was one of the most well-published in the period up until about 1960. This is his important house from 1927. Just a quick indication of the relative importance of Brazil to the broader sort of dissemination of modern architectural ideas that I'd be happy to get into some details, but I've already spent too much time on it. Okay, so to continue our story in Brazil, the details of the siding and facade treatment of the IRB building in Rio were informed by a related effort towards increasing scientific knowledge of the Brazilian territory, especially its climate. The new National Institute of Technology examined climate patterns to consider their effects on the population. Buildings, again here, were an essential medium, right? The primary means through which emergent knowledge of the natural sciences, of meteorological systems, of climate patterns, buildings were the site where that knowledge could be applied, intended to improve social well-being. This emergence, these types of drawings were not unique to Brazil, right? It's a really rich archive of drawings of these Brazilian engineers, but this was certainly not unique to Brazil. Here, a version from the American Journal Architectural Record, where similar experiments were playing out at the Royal Institute of British Architects, at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and elsewhere, perhaps even here in Poland. Again, just some hints of how these experiments in Brazil resonated across and reflected discussions in the period, previsions again of a modernization already in development. Here, another version of solar analyses on the right, reproduced by Maxwell Fry and Jane Drew, opening towards images resonant with what the media theorist Willem Flusser refers to as technical images, right? A type of media that is infused with new data and scientific approaches that is also caught up in ideas and new desires about how this knowledge influences the way that we live. Here, in a more famous sort of technical image on these terms, the one on the right here in particular, schematic bioclimatic index, as it's called, drawn by Victor and Aladar Ogyay, Hungarian-American architects very focused on climate in the 50s and 60s. We see both what is called a psychometric chart, I assume familiar to at least some of you here, this sort of general chart that shows temperature and humidity. That attempts, right, it shows temperature and humidity as an attempt to sort of map the vagaries of climate over a given site, right? The idea was you could sort of place specific conditions across this chart and figure out how to render the interior more comfortable. But even more so, again, much like our kind of butterfly catcher before, although with slightly different sort of inflection, we have this gentleman relaxing. This is Aladar Ogyay, as it happens. He's always the one pictured with a pipe, reading a newspaper, sitting in his suit and quite comfortable, right? So this kind of image of the working man of what was, at the time in the kind of New York context, the man in the gray flannel suit, quite comfortable within this space by virtue of architectural interventions. In the book on which tonight's talk is based, I talk about their work at much greater length, pursuing the Ogyay brothers' elaboration of mid-century climate diagrams and their framework for climate modeling as a sort of precursor, a sort of just before digital version of sort of climate management and performance techniques. And I'd be happy to provide details and questions. Back to Brazil again, and to the IRB. Here we have another useful early example of a technical image infused with both data and desire. We looked before at the north facade. Here is an image of the south and east facade, with a diagram drawn by Milton Roberto to explain the architect's thinking. We can see in the photograph the general approach, alternating bands of glazing and concrete. As Milton writes in this diagram here, the exterior walls could have been all glass, quote, very modern, of course, but due to sun and much light in Rio, and thanks indeed to the scientific computing done with data, end quote, so that's kind of the state of the discourse, by Paulo Sá, those images we just saw, the science basically said that it should be this sort of rectangular centered window shape, right? However, Milton Roberto continues, architecture culture suggested otherwise, as he writes, quote, everybody knows since Louis Sullivan that a horizontal window is preferred, the advantages of a window with full horizontal development, as he puts it. The results, he writes, come and take a look. Okay. So here the relative impact of this approach on the interior, aided by interior shades, internal shades. Now, this artifact is on a continuum with some of those seemingly more technical images I've just clicked through. It is less an analytic image aiming to determine the ideal design according to climatic parameters, and more a sort of post hoc justification, right, intended for the client, for publication. While a bit feeble as an argument for climatic modernity, it helps to clarify, I hope, that climate data was being brought into design methods on architectural terms, right? This is the kind of Louis Sullivan bit. As an intervention in form and facade design, as an aspect of discourse, as part of emergent and transforming architectural culture. So the social role of modern architecture was, at least in part, to adapt a building to this climatic condition. From this foundation, we can start to get a sense of, to take a look at the emergence of a certain sector of climate modernism, to start to build up the database, so to speak, the many different ways that facade treatments sought to alter the experience of the interior, to place the thermal interior in buildings that sought to place the thermal interior in a different sort of relationship with the regional climate. A sense of the ways in which a certain type of design practice was deployed to adjust these relationships. Architecture, that is, again, as a means to sort of operate on this socio-ecological nexus. One thing that some of you may have noticed in reference back to Le Corbusier's Barcelona project is that the shading devices at the IRB that we were looking at were fixed rather than dynamic, right? The same firm, the Roberto brothers, built this speculative office building, again intended for occupation by insurance agencies, seguradoras, right? It was called the Edificio Seguradoras, in downtown Rio a bit later in 1949. An important piece of evidence, we can see the differently treated facades, right? The sun-exposed facade having this elaborate shading system. And on that facade, a few different systems for adjustment. We have this set of wood louvers that are adjusted by this mechanism here, shown again here in a different sort of state of rest, right? We have also these vertical facades, and then, I'm sorry, these horizontal shading systems, and then also this, again, this kind of capacity to ventilate some of the heat that might have otherwise collected below. Paulo Ribero's speculative office building in Salvador da Bahia, further north in Brazil, had a very simple system of 2 layers of wooden slatted screens, a movable horizontal version at the interior layer, and then a fixed vertical screen at the exterior, right? So you could sort of adjust the overall sort of blocking out of radiation accordingly. Back in Rio, the Roberto brothers again designed this speculative office building on a relatively straightforward light metal shading system, easily manipulable as they're very directly demonstrating, right? So again, this kind of sense of here's how you do it, right? Come take a look. Again, we can note, the importance of this image, right, and its kind of claims to the progressive premise of their practice. An interesting also note, right, the kind of built condition that surrounds it, which was certainly of a very different period. Another Roberto brothers project that I'll spend a little time on in the conclusion, a small residential building on the then in development Copacabana Beach, built for their own occupation, the Edificio Mamãe, the building for my mother, so kind of before Venturi, right? Not that that really matters. The Edificio Mamai, built on then in development Copacabana Beach, also clarifies an essential point, right? In this section, published in both American and French journals, they provide a really sort of dynamic script, right? And again, I'll come back to this in a moment, but just to give us a sense, this sort of daily routine that one imagines of, the sun comes up, you sort of open the sash to let some air in, certainly at noon, the fixed vanes will always block the penetrating solar radiation. In the evening, you can sort of decide as you sit in your kind of garden area at the facade if you need to block the sun or not, right, according to the vagaries of a given day. So really a more dynamic, right, a really kind of elaborate set of interactions between the occupant and the facade relative to the climatic exterior. There were many others with either fixed or dynamic shades in Brazil and elsewhere, built and unbuilt, suggesting a broad effort of architects, engineers, and others in a context both geopolitical and geophysical that led in this period to the globalization of the international style, right? Which is to say, modern architecture sort of was able to become a global phenomenon by virtue of the shading device of the brise-soleil. Each building here not only brings its own set of design drivers, but also provides evidence of different aspects of climate knowledge and different socio-political contexts, as here this unbuilt headquarters for the Bahrain Petroleum Company. Okay, and this is just a slight, a smidgen, just kind of a little set of, a few examples of a very broad sort of database, again, that's elaborated in the book that allows for us to kind of get a sense of this broader array of climatic modernism. But one more Brazilian building, a better known example of architecture as a practice of climatic adaptability that allows me to clarify a few things and then move towards a kind of concluding piece, right? Likely the most famous of Brazilian shaded modernism is the Ministry of Education and Health, I assume known to some of you, if perhaps only from your survey courses in university. A building designed by Lúcio Costa with a young Oscar Niemeyer and a team of architects and engineers. I'm not going to get into the debates around whether Corb was involved, but we can talk about that at the end. He wasn't, basically, is the solution there. The sun-exposed facade, again, the north facade in the global south, contains an egg crate system, each module filled with a bank of 4 adjustable louvers. We can see the louver adjustment system here on the left. It wasn't working when I visited in 2015, but it's since been repaired. And on the bottom left here, Costa's sort of well-known technical image, right, showing how the louver system adjusted according to the daily path of the sun. And this was really more about daylight in many ways than thermal conditions, which this little dot here is the light going on, right? So this is kind of part of this indication that at certain times of day you had to flip the switch, right? But here's the important thing to note. The facade treatment of the ministry building was not only about shading per se, the direct daylighting and thermal effects on the interior, but also about the presentation of modernity, right? As Milton Roberto sketched it out relative to the IRB, come and take a look, right? Look at what we can do in this new context, a government building that sought to demonstrate on the facade for all to see the seemingly progressive economic and social principles of then President Getúlio Vargas's so-called Estado Novo. I'm not going to get in today some of the vagaries of that either, which is to say that this was, in fact, what was referred to as a benevolent dictatorship, right? A sort of authoritarian regime that sought to improve the well-being of the Brazilian population. But buildings such as this, right, this kind of facade demonstrating a certain type of modernity were essential to the kind of public relations of that regime. But the Ministry of Education and Health was, in other words, both symbolic and material. And we can then recast the insurance buildings and speculative office buildings we have reviewed as designs that saw in the climate dynamism of the facade an opportunity to intensify flows of capital, quite explicitly in many cases. Mechanisms of insurance, as we've seen, reinsurance, spaces for agents of global commerce, interior spaces conditioned, relatively, by non-mechanical means as part of a broader intensification and exploitation of resources and labor in Brazil. At the ministry building, the facade, again, aimed to reflect this form of governance, right? But it did so as a sort of mask, right? A facade in the sense of a deception, or at least a partial one, parading an enlightened approach to care for the population, which is to say the population's education and health, in the midst of a political regime that was increasingly centralized and authoritarian. A slight twist, perhaps, to what might have been today a sort of narrative of technological triumph, right, of architecture as the solution to a regionally considered, historically bounded set of geophysical complications. If only that were the case. Rather, we see in pre-war and kind of surrounding the war, World War II, climatic modernism and its legacy, quite clearly that the shaded facade was deployed to normalize the thermal interior, however inadequately on contemporary terms, much as air conditioning does today, right? So sort of a preview of it rather than an alternative to it. The goal was to make this interior adequate to a global flow of knowledge and finance according to a universal physiological norm, according to the comfort zone. Shaded modernism then was its own sort of avant-garde, as much for innovations relative to design culture as an advanced outpost of the forces of capital, of the transformation from direct colonial rule to methods of resource and labor extraction piloted by corporations. Here, in another potent example, the headquarters for British Petroleum, with banks of movable vertical louvers designed by Fry and Drew. The shading system seemingly was required to provide a space, an interior space in the tropics for occupation by British and European corporate agents in a region replete with oil, but lacking the infrastructure that could move that energy around, right, that could sort of feed a conditioning system within this building. BP House opened in Lagos, Nigeria on October 1st, the exact day, that's 1960, right? The exact day of Nigeria's independence from British rule. Right, so a too easy sort of indication of the kind of handoff from colonial occupation to globalized corporate interventionism that characterizes far too many post-colonial histories across the global south and indeed in many areas of the north as well. Here, the building as energetic object takes on an additional dimension, not only managing in the disposition of its facade system and mechanical systems, the energetic flows of global capital, but quite literally serving as a node to connect flows of capital and oil, the energy-saving facade system here facilitating administrative practices of resource extraction, labor exploitation, and indeed explicit corporate violence, as BP, Shell, and other corporations profited from the kind of frightening and ongoing decimation of the Niger Delta. Okay, so to return briefly to the comment from Barry Bergdahl, his suggestion that Brazilian experiments were not reflections of European models, but rather previsions of a modernization to come, we've seen this to be true in a few ways. In the dissemination of climate design strategies around the world, in the complications of architecture and neo-colonial corporate extractivism, in the dissemination of images and in the elaboration of specific techniques. But the modernization that came following these previsions, as we know, was not that of the design climatic dynamism. Across the 1980s, many of the buildings in Rio, in Lagos, and elsewhere had their shading devices removed, replaced with carbon-costly in-window air conditioning units, right? And I mean, this one I think is the most, in my mind, kind of atrocious, if you will, in this kind of delicate and very careful set of shading systems, sort of stripped away, but then served as the kind of support system for, you know, coolers sitting on the ledge there, right? So almost kind of in their face, right? Okay. So amidst these important historical contingencies, which is to say the relative importance of climate interwar modernism, I've and suggested here through the Brise Soleil and its development in Brazil, and also the recognition that this new evidence, sorry, here's the BP building without the louver system as well. And also the recognition that this new evidence serves to emphasize more than some sort of liberatory capacity of shaded modernism, the entanglement of modernism, capitalism, colonialism, and indeed neocolonialism. Climate in this historical condition is not a solution as much as an inflection, right? A kind of window into the complexities of architecture's imbrication in the fossil fuel era. So climate buildings, as much as any others, were sort of part of this system, right? I mean, there's no outside to the global fossil fuel regime. And so what we see is that they sort of pushed some of the edges and tried to produce alternatives, but often sort of collapsed back into serving the purpose of their clients, of their inhabitants. All the same, having said all that, these thermal practices from the 1940s offer a potent recognition of the vagaries of historical change. Evidence from a period evidence from a period just before air conditioning, in other words, can help us to think about architecture just after air conditioning, which is to say, today, hopefully. Especially insofar as these entanglements between climate and capital also emphasize the challenges of reducing carbon in a global economy that is still reliant on growth, right? We return to the premise of sufficiency, of demand management, of a framework for architecture that emphasizes the interconnection of design practice with climate governance and social habits. So this is now part 3, right? Where I'm gonna, hopefully in the next about 10 minutes, kind of summarize a set of ideas that I'm hoping to develop as a kind of set of instigations for how we can think about sort of moving forward as a field into this new era around this framework of practices, right? So I'm kind of trying this out actually for the first time, so your comments will be very much appreciated. So the edificio MMI helps us here as evidence of how a practice of climatic adaptability relies on what I think of as 3 relevant modes of practice, right? A practice of resource governance, right? Where energy comes from, how it's delivered, its relative toxicity, and how that's kind of considered with a global public in mind, right? So not about a profit motive, but about a kind of public health motive. A practice of design, which is to say how detailing a facade condition, as done, I think, quite elegantly here, that allows for, that sort of cultivates and encourages ongoing engagement with daily and seasonal climatic variations. And then a practice of use, which is to say how the inhabitant, the resident, in this case, frankly, given the class of these inhabitants, probably their domestic help, but nonetheless, how those operating within the space interacted with that facade, right? Had their own sort of thermal practices that involved working the mechanisms of the facade in order to maintain, to produce a relatively comfortable environment. This sort of form of embodied climatic engagement, right, that again we can kind of think of in terms of there's this almost script or sort of choreography that allows you to kind of walk through the day and engage this facade on different terms. For contrast, right, we can place this project next to a contemporaneous one, the Equitable Insurance Building in Portland, Oregon, designed by Pietro Beluschi, completed in 1947, and generally regarded as the first curtain wall, fully sealed building. There's some debate, but we'll leave it at that. The first building, that is, with a fully sealed facade such that an interior conditioning system was required for habitation, right? You couldn't open the window. You couldn't do anything else but adjust that HVAC system. The governance aspect at stake was the provision of as much energy as possible. This building emerged in the Pacific Northwest, which is also the site of the Boeing airplane factory, basically, right? Energy systems had been ratcheted up for the war, mostly hydroelectric power, but also fossil fuels to feed the Boeing factory. And after the war, the question was kind of, what do we do with all this energy, right? And Beluschi talks very explicitly about using the building as a solution to sort of absorb some of that power, right? So this kind of governance provision that says use as much energy as possible. And here on the left is the interior of that tower, the Portland Tower, and then another familiar building. I don't have the facade, but you can probably imagine it, the UN headquarters, which I like this image just because it's an indication of the simplicity of adjusting, right, what was called the weather master, the system that conditioned that space. So the interior of the Portland Tower, or the UN building for that matter, a very different sort of practice than that we saw at the Edificio MMI, right? A sort of non-practice in which the designer expects nothing from the user aside from the turn of the dial, a practice of alienation from the thermal interior and the weather outside, a reliance on fossil fuels, practices of inhabitation, design, and resource governments that all stand to be dramatically reconfigured. The sealed interior, as we know, has been the template for architectural and economic development of the last 70 years or so. Not just architectural innovations, but the global regime of expansive capital has relied on these regulated interior spaces for the predictability and consistency they provide. At stake for architecture today is how a practice of living in and experiencing the thermal, At stake for architecture today is how a practice of living in and experiencing the thermal space of the designed interior is both developed and trained, right? Imagined and transformed, of how this practice, and of course this is likely my main point, how reimagining a sort of practice of comfort, how we feel inside, has direct impact on carbon emissions and resonates beyond that thermal interior into the planetary biophysical system. And thereby how a practice of discomfort, right, which I'm calling this kind of shift to this practice of comfort, it's kind of inversion, might allow for a different set of causes and effects, might allow for a future that is, I mean, any future at all, on the one hand, or a future that can kind of allow us to live at least relatively comfortably within these buildings. So again, to sort of kind of tie things up or maybe open them up to discussion this evening, I want to focus just for a second on this dynamic of comfort and discomfort and really the kind of practice of discomfort, really just a few more minutes. So comfort is not a universal value, right? It's an elite position, right? It's an aspiration, it's a luxury commodity that emphasizes consistency, normalcy, and predictability, that allows for increased productivity or the pleasure of a good night's sleep. A collective allegiance to comfort is a form of self-assurance, right? That we're not threatened and that tomorrow will be like today. Comfort is an indication of having, more sort of broadly and socially, of having risen above the inconsistencies of the natural world, of having triumphed not only nature itself and the weather, but over chance, right? Over the kind of unpredictability or inconsistency of the outside world. We rely on this interior comfort. Indeed, that is one of its primary attributes, that it is reliable, right? That it's always there when we get back. We can adjust the dial accordingly. But comfort is not universal, to repeat. It's a contingent thermal experience codified as a norm, right? Reified as a universal value. And those of you involved in this discussion in various ways, probably know about this sort of premise of adaptive comfort and many other kind of theories that are circulating and practices that are circulating on these terms. Comfort has been integral to the designed interiors of over-industrialized countries. Indeed, it has been one of the projects of design to provide comfort. It's essential to the causal chain that weaves together mechanical heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems, the fuels that feed them, and the carbon emissions that result. It is, in effect, what the silly buildings with solar panels, as with the quote that I started with, are trying to provide more efficiently. So when we turn the dial of a thermostat, we are exacerbating inequity, perpetuating violence. Or, as the Austro-American architect Richard Neutra put it in 1947, about the same time, again, as these buildings, quote, "There has always been comfort in the world, reckless comfort, we could say, comfort based on someone else's continuous labors," end quote. So the framework of practice, of social practice, I think helps us to disentangle and reimagine this comfort challenge, right? I mean, this is the kind of challenge we face as scholars, as designers, as architects. Practice has recently been revived as a figure of thought in many fields, as a means to explore the changes needed to adapt societies to new conditions of energy use in the face of the climate emergency. So it's not just about the thermal interior. Essential to this broad premise, to this sort of zeroing in on practice as a conceptual space for transformation, is the premise, a corollary premise, that there is no single template or pattern to which daily life conforms, right? There's no essential practice, there's simply what we do. There's no universal norm, there's no universal comfort or human nature, no way that things need to be. Practice is a way of framing daily life, the discussion of daily life, which emphasizes that these patterns and templates are malleable and changeable, learned and relearned, contingent and conditioned, right? So helping us to see, for example, that in fact we have been conditioned by air conditioning as much as the spaces that we inhabit. At stake in reconsidering the contingent practice of comfort and discomfort is, following here Elizabeth Shove and Nicole Sperling, examining, quote, "the threads of interdependence that hold constellations and complexes of practice provisionally in place, and how and why these threads tighten and slacken," which is to say how practices relate to one another. How can we place the practice of discomfort, then, in the context of extractive resource imperatives and the premise of economic growth on the one hand, and the attention, or not, of designers to thermal conditions, to HVAC systems, to thermal mass, induced ventilation, et cetera, on the other? So to kind of see this question of practice in the interior, both relative to design and the kind of resource extractive principles that we still all kind of implicitly live by. In other words, practice frames our placement among a spectrum of comfort as produced over and over through a set of interdependencies that extend from personal habits and interiors to the cultural viability of thermal design principles to policy engagement with resources. From my decision to put on a sweater or not, I brought one with me in case it was cold in here, right? To that sort of micro decision, if you will, to the debates at COP27, with architecture again as a kind of mediating system. Framing these three levels as practices allows us to consider how changes to one thread might allow for some room for change or tighten the relationship to others. Discomfort, then, as a practice, is not, or not only, the actual experience of discomfort, of an unpleasant time in a thermal interior, right? It's not just about being hot or cold, but is rather an aspiration that resonates across at least these three correlated practices, which is to say at least this question of the thermal practice of individuals and interiors, of the design practices that facilitate different sorts of interaction in those interiors, and then of course the kind of geoengineering discourse or the sort of broader resource extraction discourse. These are all practices of discomfort. These are all practices where we're sort of challenging ourselves to transform. Our world was built according to a specific, the built environment that surrounds us, changing as often as it does, is built according to a specific set of socioeconomic conditions, collective desires, and cultural interests. It is being rebuilt perpetually, constantly, right, according to new conditions, new desires, new frameworks for cultural elaboration. Such reconstructions, retrofits, and reimaginations also reimagine relationship to resources, economy, exchange, and equity. They imagine new kinds of desire and satisfaction, and they rely on this transformation of practice. Practicing discomfort involves encouraging participation in a changed global thermal regime. It involves recognizing that the past 7 decades of air conditioning, as I said, has also, or perhaps even most importantly, been people conditioning, right? And that we can condition ourselves otherwise, that our built environment and our own experience of it is radically contingent. The practice of discomfort treasures the global collective over the individual. It insists that many of us in the North can handle discomfort, can demand less, right? Can sort of manage our demand differently, so as to provide opportunities for survival and maybe even self-realization, in short, some kind of future for communities that have not benefited from decades of seemingly cheap energy. Amidst this causal chain that I've been mapping, and according to these various examples that I've put on the table, and our implicit participation as inhabitants of these spaces, the practice of discomfort, I hope, is something that we can see as, at the very least, not too much to ask. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much. Now it's time for questions.
Or answers are fine too.
So in this case, maybe I will start. You put the issue of discomfort. I think that we are in a moment of some transition on the level of philosophy, even and our approach towards the whole civilization that is all around. But on the other hand side, we can see that the system that produced the air conditioning is still here, very strong. So maybe very naive question, what to do?
What do we do? Yeah, what is to be done? No, I mean, I think it's very much the case, and I think it's part of what, why I start with that slightly humorous quote out of COP27 of the silly buildings with solar panels. I mean, the building industry, let's say, it's not sort of architects exclusively, incredibly challenged by this climate challenge, right? I mean, insofar as the last 70 years, the kind of infrastructures that have been set in place, the supply chains and the capacity to specify certain materials, et cetera, have all been sort of incessantly it's almost as if we were trying to use as much fossil fuel as possible as we set up implicitly those different supply chains, right? And in fact, we were in effect, right? I mean, we meaning, I guess, Americans in that sense, but the sort of global transformation of the economy in the 50s and 60s that was so reliant upon the fossil fuel, the distribution and processing of fossil fuels, in the American context, again, the project was very explicitly, how can we use as much energy as possible so that we have as much control over the Middle East, et cetera. I mean, these are maybe relatively familiar stories, but energy is a geopolitical aspect as well as a geophysical object. And so understanding how energy moves and sort of travels was a big part of setting up this kind of economic system that we live in. So it's deeply embedded in our building industry practices, right? And I mean, there was a moment in New York about, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years ago now, when there was the announcement of a New York Green New Deal, right? Of a kind of prospect for changing the way that we live and build in that city. And the then mayor, de Blasio, right, was his name? Yeah, said, because of the climate cost of these materials, we will not have any more buildings in New York City with, glass, concrete, and steel. Right, and I mean the building industry just laughed and went on their day, right, and they meant nothing. Nothing happened. There was no legislation because it was just this impossible prospect, right, to completely transform so directly. So it's in part, I think, just to recognize the challenge we face, right, to recognize that, in terms of kind of what is to be done, that what we understand of as architecture is so embedded in the fossil fuel regime that it's going to be a lot of work to extract it. And it's going to be uncomfortable, right? It's going to be uncomfortable sort of in terms of people's lives and kind of career aspirations, right? I mean, I mostly talk to students, as I spend most of my time teaching, and a lot of what I try to do is sort of cultivate other aspirations, right? Maybe the project isn't to become some star designer that puts skyscrapers all over the world, but to come up with a really good solution to rapid insulation deployment in the UK or something like that, right? I mean, other sorts of built environment, creative challenges that can help us to kind of approach these kind of solutions on very different terms. There's something else I was going to say there, but it's a big question, of course. But I think, yeah, I'm just kind of recognizing that we're at a state. Oh, what I was going to say is it's not just architecture, right? It's not like we're the bad people and everybody else is kind of going along. I mean, the food industry, the clothing industry, the car industry, the airline, and I mean, tourism, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, this is a much broader set of kind of changing aspirations, right? Of kind of solicitations of different ways of life. So I don't mean to say in any way that kind of architecture is sort of stuck in some difficult place that, and that Mies van der Rohe is to blame for his horrible Seagram's Tower. But rather that, in our field, as in the slow food movement, right? I don't really want to get into electric vehicles, but as into the move towards public transportation, let's say, right? These questions are happening in all professional fields and all kind of forms of public life. But I think in part because architecture is so rooted in private capital, generally speaking, at least architecture, again, in the kind of global north and the over-industrialized countries, it's very difficult to divorce, right, from this premise of economic growth and the kind of, what the market demands, right? So do we change the market or do we just build different things and let people catch up, right? I mean, these are questions that we need to be asking, right? And I certainly don't have the answers, but I think part of what I'm trying to put on the table is a set of narratives, a set of stories that kind of opens this up, helps us to realize that other opportunities have been possible, right? However compromised they might have been in their time. And that we need to be kind of thinking through these options again today. I think that was an unsatisfying answer.
Oh. One moment.
Actually, do we have any data what condition was inside those buildings which you show us?
Sure.
Because nowadays modern air conditioning gives us a wide range of control. Yeah. We can have 40 degrees outside and less than 20 inside. Yeah. Same is with humidity. Yeah. So do we have any data?
Yeah. So not exactly. There's speculative data. I have a PhD student who's modeling historically modeling the interior of these buildings, right? And I don't have it at my fingertips, but the basic answer is it was nothing compared to air conditioning. I mean, HVAC systems work really well, right? And you've kind of pointed out two of the essential aspects. I mean, one, of course, cooling in a hot region like Brazil. Even today, there's a kind of business culture that says you don't have to wear a jacket. You can kind of work in shirt sleeves because it's just even with HVAC, it can be too energy intensive. It's hot, right? So it's in part to say that No, these, relative to today's ASHRAE regulations, right? I mean, various forms of regulatory systems that monitor the thermal and air quality of interiors, these buildings would fail hopelessly, right? They weren't cold enough. You couldn't control them. There was no dial to turn, right? If you changed the louver, it's not like it would suddenly get colder. You know, you couldn't go stand over next to the vent and get refreshed, right? You had to just kind of let the air vent out and slowly recirculate, right? It was a much more complex and slow system. But the other word that you used, right, that's going to be the kind of, frankly, terror for the next century or so, if not longer, is humidity. Air conditioning, really the main thing that air conditioning does for humanity is reduce humidity, right? Dramatically and effectively. And there's really, and since this period, as you know, I've looked in the archives of a lot of the early sort of architectural discussions around cooling, you know, the kind of debates about passive and active cooling. And, you know, even then it was like, we can't do anything about the humidity though, right? I mean, if we want to manage the humidity, you got to stick a mechanical system in there, right? So that's really where this kind of comfort thing comes to the fore, right? Humidity is uncomfortable. Heat and cold, we can, you know, generally kind of manage. We can take off a jacket or put on a sweater, right? But humidity, it's just soup, right? I mean, you just can't breathe sometimes, right? So, you know, I have a joke with when I used to live in Philadelphia and a friend in Baltimore, and, you know, two academics trying to see how long we could go on a given kind of week in August without turning on the air conditioning when the humidity is at like 90%, right? And it wasn't very long, you know? But it was also like, okay, but maybe I can just lie here and sweat, right? Like maybe I don't need to write another article, right? Maybe we need to kind of shift our aspirations in terms of our productive capacities. Which is a lot of what air conditioning and kind of humidity control in some ways is about, right? That's kind of level of comfort. Shift our expectations of comfort once we recognize that comfort on the inside, right, is in effect producing discomfort on the outside. And that equation is very direct, right? It's not locally direct. Like, you know, any of the office towers, let's say the pencil tower that I showed earlier on, right? One of the, I mean, again, like a building that seems to say, how much carbon can I use, please, right? I mean, the air conditioning, it's all sealed and it's incredibly HVAC intensive. You know, it's not that difficult to draw the line between that building and, you know, whether it's a heat wave in the Indian subcontinent or a forest fire in California. You know, we know that the increase in carbon emissions is producing these effects, right? So there's almost this temporal lag, right, of how do we, as a global society, experience the impact of those effects, you know, when we're turning on the air conditioner. You know, it's like the carbon tax thing. Like if you go to fill up your car and, you know, the petrol is 10 times more because of a carbon tax, maybe you'll take the bus, right? You experience at the point of sale. You know, so it's almost like we want the dial to like get hot sometimes or something, or, you know, somehow kind of encourage you to not turn it up or down, as the case may be, recognizing that the effects are real and happening all the time, right? And I think one of the things that's shifted really just in the past, I don't know, year or two, is that we're no longer saying, oh, climate change is coming, right? I mean, we just had a discussion before, you know, it's getting hotter every summer in Central Europe, right? And verifiably, you know, according to the data and also according to our experience, right? So we're no longer having this discussion, or at least we should no longer be having the discussion of, you know, what will we be doing in the future to sort of manage this problem? But people are dying today, right? I mean, people are suffering today, and maybe more so at given episodes when there's a heat wave, when there's a forest fire, when there's a flood, we kind of experience these intensities, right? But it's happening all the time. And so we have to recognize that the kind of, you know, this is the kind of terror we're living in as, you know, practitioners in the built environment, that the world that we have produced is causing violence on a regular basis, right? And we need to figure out ways to sort of reduce that, adjust that, mediate that, mitigate that. And this, you know, air conditioning and humidity are not the only reasons for that, right? And we could get into the, you know, problems of global capital and all sorts of kind of larger scale issues. But those are the things that we have some capacity to engage with, right? So, I mean, back to your question, these buildings were uncomfortable on today's terms, but part of what that suggests is how do we switch those terms, right? And how does that discomfort become, you know, if not pleasant, at least kind of satisfactory, right? You know, so again, that debate with my friend in Baltimore became how low can you set the air conditioner? right? We can't live without it in that 90-degree, 90% humidity day, but kind of how little can we get away with, right? And you know, this, I mean, I'm jumping into another zone altogether relative to the question, but this gets more complicated post-COVID, or late COVID, I don't know what it is exactly, but which is to say the kind of, you know, everybody, or not everybody, but the relative abandonment of the center city office, right, to working from home, or at least some flexibility. You know, buildings are constructed so that they can handle air conditioning in the hottest part of the summer. If everybody just works from home for those 2 weeks, then that mechanical plant can be significantly smaller. I mean, in places like the eastern seaboard of the US, where the heat and humidity is very different in August than the rest of the year, you have these huge mechanical plants, right, that are really only turned all the way up for those, but they're there all the time. And you know that if you can turn it up, sometimes you do, right? But if you just have a smaller plant. So recognizing that the social use of buildings is transforming dramatically, right? In residences and in commercial spaces, also in leisure and institutions, et cetera. So those are more opportunities for kind of, thinking about how to shift our patterns, basically.
Questions, comments?
I have a question regarding that discussion between European Union or the US or Canada versus some countries from global south in terms of like fossil fuels and how much they can use to develop themselves as a country. Do you think that now it's sort of the switch of like those countries didn't have the resources to use them before versus now they have and they want to use it slowly, like less than we did previously? But do you think there is opportunity for Europe to develop those climate solutions for design, or do you think that those countries have like longer traditions and they're also have like lower expectations regarding their comfort zone?
A really important set of questions, and in a number of discussions that I've had around these topics, I've been rightfully given a hard time, calling for discomfort, insofar as that's what I'm doing, is a radically privileged thing to do, right? Which is to say, in many cases, it's life or death. It's, or health, or health and well-being. It's not, do I wear a sweater or not, or what sort of, it's not these kind of minor decisions that we might make in our own lives, but quite dramatic decisions, right? And questions of quality of life, of longevity, of birth rates, and all of these things, right? So one thing I would say, which isn't quite an answer to your question, but just to kind of defend myself from the criticism that I have internally, right, is that in my mind, this is really a discussion about the global north. And as I'm now living in Australia part-time, the over-industrialized countries, as I like to call them, because it's not only geographic, which is to say we have benefited enough from fossil fuels, is one way of kind of thinking about that, right? Too much, perhaps, right? Overextended are the kind of capacity of those fuels to not only bring us kind of comfort and consistency, but luxury, right? And so I think that there's Andreas Malm spends a lot of time with this framework of the distinction between survival emissions and luxury emissions, right? And I think that, it's an important thing for us to think about here, which is to say, certainly some things are survival. I mean, hospitals, I include kind of museums and archives as survival, right? They need to be kind of well-conditioned. But a lot of things are not. And that whether that's, driving when you could take a bus, or again, turning the HVAC system, when is it luxury? Where do we draw that line? And there's no rules there, right? But I think it's an important question to keep in mind. And that's a very different line in other parts of the world, right? And so I think part of what, I used to say about 2 years ago, I would use the phrase, talk about sort of what's left in our carbon budget should be dedicated to the health and well-being of those who have not benefited from fossil fuels. And that doesn't mean kind of refrigerators for everybody, right? I mean, I think implicit in your question is a realm of technological innovation that's really important today, everywhere, is how to provide for the well-being needs of the global south in the least carbon emissive way possible, right? So, and there's lots of ways to do that, you know, from solar panels to thermal mass in terms of building environments. But again, some, you know, a hospital tends to need air conditioning, right? I mean, there's some places where it's hard to draw that line. So, yeah, so to, you know, I used to say, let's focus the rest of our carbon budget on the global south, but we don't have a carbon budget anymore, right? I mean, that's, I mean, the kind of science has transformed quite a bit in the last kind of 2 or 3 years to say that, oh, you know, 1.5 degrees, not gonna have, not, you know, not looking very likely. I mean, more recently, like, not at all, right? But so I think it's a really, you know, again, it's just a set of huge challenges. But I think that the general framing that says, you know, there are people with survival needs where fossil fuels can play a role, and those needs should overwhelm those of the kind of luxury conditions of many of us in the North, right? And, you know, I say this as somebody who flies much too frequently and who, you know, eats food that's carbon dependent, et cetera. I mean, it's not like the shifts in lifestyle are difficult, you know, they challenge our kind of senses of self, our kind of aspirations for the future, what we want for our children, right? I mean, our lives have, we have all, if I may speak for all of us, you know, grown up amidst a world so replete with fossil fuels that we can't even imagine life without it, or it's very difficult to, right? And so part of what's at stake is that imaginary. I mean, that's part of what architecture can do, just to bring it more directly to the field rather than kind of you know, technology more generally, is to articulate that imaginary and kind of expand that imaginary of life before and after fossil fuels and how it can be viable. But I think, yeah, the main issue is how to develop means to engage with those for which emissions are a survival issue rather than a luxury issue, right? But what, I'm sorry, just one other thing. One other thing is that I think the premise that European, and you didn't quite say this, but it's something that I've heard before, that part of the project of the EU, and indeed the new European Bauhaus says this, it's not right at the top, but it's more or less explicit. You know, part of part of the project is to develop technological innovations that will serve the needs of the global south, right, of, let's say, survival emissions. But I think also implicit in your question was that a lot of that knowledge should actually come from there, right? Which is to say, it almost goes the other way, which is we kind of need, that's what you were trying to say, okay. Yeah, yeah.
Who has the biggest advantage right now? There are people who've been doing this for such a long time, or we, you know, we are quite new to that in that matter.
Yeah, no, indeed. Well, right, and I mean, I'm working on a project with the German Green Building Council that's basically, I mean, it's not being stated quite so explicitly, but it's basically how can we learn from the global south in terms of novel climate management techniques, right? And provide funding and provide resources and, you know, see that kind of knowledge transfer as essential to our collective future, right? Yeah, I think that's a huge piece of it. And you know, and much of what I've shown, you know, I mean, this facade right here, right? We could pretty easily trace it back, the one on the right, of course, to a set of traditional practices of shading, of screens, of you know, various forms of you know, shifting your relationship between interior and exterior as the day goes on, that were in effect modernized by architectural modernism, right? Or I should say technologized by modernism, right? That are kind of trying to do something of the same thing, right? But with a different set of tools. And so going back to that knowledge and recognizing its value for the future, I think is a big piece of this, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you.
Questions? Comments?
I have a question about the theory. All that issues which you mentioned in your lecture sounds reasonable. And do you know any building, modern building, built just nowadays, who may be using that possibilities? Maybe for us it's just an experience which we need to make the decision that our comfort may be a bit less.
I'll just use one that I think you might all know, rather than try to pull up a slide. But Lacaton and Vassal's Grand Park in Bordeaux, right? Which these 60s slab towers, I think there were 9 of them, that were retrofit with an additional facade, right? And I mean, do people know this project a little bit? Maybe. I mean, it's easy to find.
Yes, of course.
Okay. They won the Pritzker Prize, not exactly for it, but yeah, it was a big piece of it. And I think that was a big moment, right? I mean, insofar as Anne Lacaton has sort of taken this charge, like, do not demolish, right? I mean, I think that was a big moment for the Pritzker Prize to be given to architects who focus on retrofit and reuse. And I mean, also pissed a bunch of people off, right? But I think that on the one hand, that building in the premise of reuse, right? I mean, the kind of embodied carbon aspect, right? That was sort of not spent in that project, and not only the sort of, you know, basic kind of technical premise of reuse, but really just a beautiful space to live in that was produced through that process, right? It's not worse than any neighboring building that was built in the last 10 years. I mean, you know, generally speaking, right? I mean, it appears to be a very livable and comfortable space. You know, and even that the way that they did the construction, the inhabitants were not displaced, right? They were able to live through, I mean, probably not always fun, but they were able to live through they didn't have to move, right? Which is a big deal. And especially given that it's a public housing project, a lot of them have been there for decades, right? So just, you know, a lot going on there that goes far beyond the kind of climatic aspects. I mean, I would include the retrofit kind of principle within the kind of climate realm. But also, right, so they added this kind of, you know, additional facade that's effectively a thermal buffer, right? I mean, it's a balcony, it's an enclosed balcony that allows you to, that can absorb the heat in the summer. You can sort of close off, right, an interior door so that it, is a thermal buffer for heat in the summer months, and then and also in the winter it can be closed off so that it, you know, kind of keeps some of the chill out. And I think there's even layers of curtains both on the external facade and then on the internal facade that, you know, facilitate that thermal buffering. So that's one project, you know, where even precisely even the kind of facade section, right, becomes the space where this innovation occurs. And I generally, you know, I think there's a lot of great work going on that is trying to think about new models for design. I mean, I guess I would say that it's hard for me to identify projects, because part of what I'm interested in, you know, is, I don't want to put this too strongly because I'll feel bad about it later, but how can we start to kind of really imagine an architecture that is not about the kind of celebration of an individual project, right? Or, I mean, and I don't mean this as a critique of your question. I think it's a really important question. What are the models, right? And I wish I had an answer. I'm feeling very self-conscious because I want to have a list. I want to, like, put up a list of 100 buildings that you should go study, right? But I think that part of what, you know, and part of what Lacaton and Vassal, I think, also helps us to see, somewhat strangely, is that a kind of more humble sort of approach, right? I mean, some of them, I mean, like, I'm really interested in I mentioned this briefly a moment ago, the kind of insulation, the project of insulating buildings in the UK in the midst of a very difficult energy, you know, politically induced energy crisis, economically induced energy crisis. You know, how does that become a kind of model for kind of architectural or design practice, right? You know, how does just the sort of premise of retrofit more generally as a means to change the mechanical systems, right, to sort of recraft the carbon needs of buildings throughout an urban landscape, right, that might not even be visible. I mean, might be. I mean, certainly the Lacaton-Vassal project, very visible, right? I mean, it's not to say that design has no role at all, but the role of design is maybe not the one that we're familiar with, right? It's not the kind of signature building, even at the small scale, right? I mean, I think a lot, I mean, you know, as I'm saying this, of course, projects are coming into my head, right? Then there's a firm called Keramik Kuo that works mostly in Zurich and Switzerland, you know, which is kind of its own world in terms of these climate discussions. The regulations are so severe, but their approach is to try to kind of push the regulations so that not only it's kind of even more, you know, less carbon emitted than required, but they're kind of pushing against some of the, you know, the exact opening of the windows, et cetera, as a means to kind of still be creatively operating as designers amidst these restraints, seeing that as an opportunity, right? So, you know, again, but these are not kind of elaborate, beautiful buildings. These are very simple, mostly apartments, fitting into small lots often, right? So I think that kind of humble approach is one that is very productive for us today. But I should have a better list. Yeah. And we all should have a better list, yeah.
You mentioned about connection between comfort outside and comfort inside. And I would like to ask you about landscape architects' cooperation with architects. I know that in Rio de Janeiro, Burle Marx cooperated with these famous architects. He designed green roofs, for example, and surrounding of the buildings. And could you say a few words about it, about the past and future?
Yeah, absolutely. And indeed, I kind of ran through the slide, but the IRB building that we were looking at, the roof terrace was designed by Burle Marx, right? I mean, you almost say, of course, right? I mean, it was everything was. You know, I think, and landscape has had an interesting trajectory, which is to say that, you know, more or less the same moment historically when architects began to sort of embrace this question of green architecture and the kind of, you know, the kind of philosophy of efficiency, right? I mean, which again has been a total mess, but has been very active at the same time. I mean, it's been a big part of the technological expansion of the field, of kind of forms of innovation. You know, now it's robotics and AI are also kind of playing the same game. So it's one thing to say that those aren't necessarily technologies or issues that we don't want to pursue, but it's just sort of how we pursue them, right? So while architects began to pursue this kind of premise of efficiency, landscape architects, I mean, as I'm sure many of you know, right, really dug into this question of ecological systems and how, you know, how one can begin to understand a given territory for the kind of environmental attributes that it. I don't want to say ecosystem services because that's a bit too much of a sort of corporate caving in some ways, but a recognition that on the one hand, in that kind of ecosystem services way, I guess I am saying it. On the one hand, there are kind of specific benefits that can be drawn from territorial zones that can, you know, the water can be redistributed to help with cooling. I mean, again, these are things that I'm sure many of you know. Plantings can certainly help to absorb heat, et cetera. But also that I think another big piece of that work that's been influential and that's been difficult, but not, you know, not that it hasn't had a role in architecture, but has been more the kind of experience of those spaces, right? And the recognition that well, I guess the broader recognition. I mean, you know, one of the biggest, most important books about climate change from 1986, Bill McKibben's book, The End of Nature, right? This kind of notion that now that we're impacting the climate, there's nothing, you know, now we call it the Anthropocene, right? There's nothing that's not touched by humans, right? But how that relative experience of the natural world shifts our understanding of our own relationship to it, right? So that you know, so landscape architecture, insofar as it sort of curates an experience of nature, and often quite explicitly so, can allow for a kind of understanding, not in a kind of nostalgic sense of kind of what have we lost as we're burning things down collectively, right? But more a sense of what could we gain from maintaining a productive relationship to the outside world, right? Which is to say the sealed facade seals us off, right? And that's been one kind of set of principles and set of ideals and set of trajectories. But how we kind of maintain that porosity is another way of living, right? That I think landscape architects have a lot of tools to help us appreciate, I guess. I could go from there with the kind of porosity sealed bit to the passive house, but if we wanted to.
I see one comment.
At the beginning of the lecture, you showed us this, I believe you called it pencil tower.
Yeah,
I mean this
super tall. Super tall is the other
skyscraper in the New York, and I think it's one of the few super pencil towers which are called together like Millionaires Row or something, and they are like top-notch technical wonders. And I'm thinking, are they equipped with something special keeping temperature
Yeah,
and things
yeah.
like that.
Yeah,
Are there something special in them?
Indeed, and I'm spending. I wanted to spend the time clicking back to it because the image helps us to respond to that. I mean, you know, these are very difficult projects, I think. I mean, by which I mean, insofar as you know, and there, as you suggested, there's about a dozen of them now. Insofar as they represent, you know, one of the kind of horizons of architectural innovation, I think they're a big struggle for the field to kind of overcome sort of damage that's been done, right? For a number of reasons. And I'll get to the specifics of your question in a second, but most of this building in particular is unoccupied, right? I mean, these are shell companies that have purchased these to, you know, basically launder money from all over the world, right? And it doesn't even try to work that well, right? I mean, it was built, you know, in terms of the interior. There were hilarious stories in the New York Times and the Guardian about a year after it was built of, you know, people getting stuck in elevators on like the 110th floor for, you know, of water kind of cascading down the elevator shafts as moon. I mean, it's very difficult to bring water pressure up that high, for example, right? Of course, the sway is not a non-issue, although it's very well managed, as you're suggesting, in terms of some structural innovations. But the thing I want to point out is, according to the New York City Building Code, floor area that's occupied by mechanical systems does not count for height, right? So all of these little buffer zones here, and there's another one that's harder to see in this image, are effectively allowing the building to exceed even more the regulated height capacity, right? Because they're just filled with air conditioner. This is all systems. It's not just air conditioning. It's also, of course, it's heating, it's water and circulation, right? Many other things. But the point being that the intense demands of air conditioning, of HVAC, I should say, because heating, of course, is a big issue at that elevation. The intense demands of air conditioning, of HVAC required those spaces, right, required those kind of buffers, but they also allowed it to kind of be built taller, right? So this kind of race to the top, right, that's been going on, that I think has started to subside. But, you know, this isn't the last one. There's a shop building that's just recently topped out. But this kind of, you know, who can build the highest has basically been who can add the most HVAC so that we can sort of boost up the code parameters to allow for us to go a little higher than the one next door, right? So it's a very insipid, and I don't know. I mean, I was saying before that I don't blame Mies van der Rohe for kind of using too much energy in the Seagram's Tower, right? And I mean, others do. Barnabas Calder just wrote an article in Architects Journal that the title is something along the lines of, "We used to praise the Seagram's Tower, now we should bury it," or something like that, right? So, you know, it's worth reading. I mean, that's not quite my position, but I get it. I think this is kind of evil, right? And I think there's a capacity for somebody of the reputation and wealth of Vignoli to say no, right? So this, I mean, you know, the Seagram's Tower, it's in the past, I can kind of understand it. This kind of pisses me off, right? Because it's just not helping anybody. It's just greed incarnate in architecture, right? And you know, the air conditioning aspects of it, even worse, right? Or the HVAC aspects of it even worse. But I, you know, this is and the biggest problem is that it's seen as the future, right? I mean, in the Guardian, when this building and others were being built, this kind of picture of the New York City skyline, you know, the super tall towers of the future, and a former colleague of mine, Stefan Ahl, has published a book kind of to that effect. You know, somebody's future, right? I mean, and this is the other kind of harsh reality of the sealed office tower or the sealed residential tower is that as, you know, the world decays around it, right? I like to think of a Trump Tower in this regard because it just the images of what goes on inside are a little more visible in one's mind. You know, as I mean, quite literally, the seas rise and the lower Manhattan begins to flood, et cetera, you know, without aggressive governmental and international, you know, kind of NGO intervention, the future that we will likely face is rich people sealing themselves off in HVAC fed towers, continuing to use fossil fuels with maybe a few solar panels on top, right? While the rest of us suffer. I mean, this is the trajectory that we're currently on. You know, as we look at the COP meeting and see that what was it, 800 private jets, right? And kind of more fossil fuel representatives than representatives of affected countries, right? You know, how can we kind of preserve this way of life, this comfort for those who can afford it at the expense of everyone else? And you know, I'm a relatively privileged person, but in that regard, I see myself within the everyone else. I mean, I'm not at that level of, you know, this kind of thing, right? And or even close. And so, you know, what we see in here is a vision of the future that is really frightening. And that I think is part of what we really need to be pushing against. How we push against it, you know, that's up to kind of all of us, but to recognize that it's not the way to go, yeah.
Sufficiency instead of efficiency. That's the very good motto.
Yeah, this is not survival emissions, right? This is luxury emissions, yeah? And it's certainly more than sufficient, beyond sufficiency. It's more than one needs.
Daniel, thank you so very much for eye-opening, I think, giving us many thoughts to digest and to think about, and maybe to think about what we are doing with our reality and what we can do for the future. I will switch to Polish right now.
Okay.
Proszę Państwa, chciałem bardzo podziękować za to dzisiejsze spotkanie, podziękować też za wszystkie spotkania w ramach cyklu Elementy Architektury, które Fundacja Instytut Architektury realizuje wspólnie z Instytutem Goethego już od 2017 roku. Zapis większości spotkań możecie Państwo odnaleźć na naszym kanale w profilu YouTube. Natomiast mam nadzieję, że już niedługo będziemy Państwa mogli zaprosić na kolejne spotkania, pewnie już w przyszłym roku. Bardzo serdecznie dziękuję.